Want to spend less time figuring out how to hunt and spend more time scaring animals out of their beds? Check out my course at mountainbowhunting.teachable.com. The first 50 people to sign up get 50% off with code EARLYBIRD. See you around the pond. Where do elk bed? Elk bed, generally speaking, on north-facing slopes. That's because up here in the northern hemisphere, the sun is centered on the earth and it's shining down directly on the equator, right? And if you can imagine, this is the equator line, this is the southern hemisphere, this is the northern hemisphere where we are. If it's shining in this direction, anything north-facing and is on the side of a mountain will receive less light. Something that I found interesting as we sat here and discussed this, Where All the Elk video stuff, was that this porch is north facing that I'm sitting in, and it never receives sunlight. This back area behind me, this step, this area like where I'm sitting actually, we're in the very middle of summer, and so the sun is directly above us as it's going to be, and this porch was constructed here for that exact reason. The previous folks really like to do a lot of food prep out here of all types, and so just being in the shade and having a nice consistently cool area for that was really important for them. And so it was just so interesting how applicable it was that here I am in the middle of the afternoon, it's 1:30 and it's 4th of July, and it's north facing and perfectly shady here. So what an interesting and appropriate place to sit for that. So generally speaking, they will prefer north-facing slopes, and if they really have their druthers, if you will, they're gonna bed on a northeast-facing slope, because the morning sun that comes up and does hit that east-facing slope right away is going to be much less north-facing with an east-facing preference on it. Is going to be much less, that morning sun will be much less intense than that afternoon sun, just because of the way that the heat builds through the day. And so they're wise to this. And I've seen in prime elk habitat where they've got wonderful areas to pick here and there for all different types of bedding, that they will consistently pick nice northeast beds in steep, somewhat steep kind of slot canyons. They're safe in there. They can hear things coming and see very well below them. They can hear things coming up behind them. And again, that steepness is also going to reduce the amount of light that gets in there. So they're pretty savvy about where they bed if they have their choice about it. But they can also be highly adaptable. They're as calorically efficient as possible out of necessity or they'll die, so they move as little as possible. They regulate their temperatures to stay as cool as they can all day. The way that I kind of phrase this for folks is, imagine that, you are out there in the hills all night, even in the summer. It gets pretty darn cold out there, and so if you had to make it out there and just kind of sleep in the grass, you'd have to be wearing some pretty thick wool long underwear and a big old poofy coat and some beanies and all that, and you're not allowed to take that off during the day, just like an elk isn't. And so what would you do? You would find the shadiest, coolest spot and move as little as possible, get up and get a huge drink of water or two when you needed, but I mean, maybe munch some food, but even that's going to make you hot. So most of the time, you're not going to do anything, especially on a hot day. And so something to consider about thermoregulation needs. North-facing slopes, somewhat close access to water, ideally for food. That's an ideal bedding space. The bulls are not super interested in food in this time. In fact, they lose an insane amount of body weight during this period. Their body is producing so much adrenaline and cortisol and those types of things that their appetite is pretty well entirely suppressed, and they're not interested in eating. They're interested in mating behavior. If possible, Colorado elk will, during the rut, exist in a smaller area than they generally do. Colorado elk are semi-nomadic, meaning they definitely will have areas that they consistently occur in, but it's not uncommon for them to also travel 5-10 miles in a day and start habituating a different habitat, or unfortunately for you, possibly a different GMU. If they can find one of those safe rutting areas where they're not being harassed, it's good to not have to to relocate, because they've found an area that affords them safety through less human interaction. Elk in general are much less tolerant of being what we call bumped than deer, and bumped meaning becoming aware of your presence in a somewhat close quarters, like 100 yards or less, we'll say. And often without smelling you. If they smell you, we may say that you scared them away or spooked them out. But bumping them often means like they become aware of your presence through sight or sound, maybe don't identify you. They don't spook off immediately. They may leave in the very short aftermath of that, but more than anything, they're just kind of like, all right, I know something's there. So elk are way less tolerant of being bumped than deer. And so they will be much more select about their bedding places. This is in my experience. They will walk quite some distance to get to a safe bed, whereas deer will go nearby or kind of on the go. So like I just alluded to just a little bit about benches, when I talked about preferred bedding areas on those northeast slopes and the steep areas, elk will really prefer benches. You got to consider that an elk is a pretty solid size animal, anywhere from 300 to just under 1,000, for the humongous ones. And that's a lot of weight to carry. And so it's advantageous and much easier to exist if you can lay that body weight down on more of a flat plane or slope than something that is sloped. And so for bedding considerations, sometimes they'll bed right up against a tree that's under them so that they can kind of lean against it for sure and brace themselves. But a lot of times they'll find what are called benches. And so a bench is exactly that. It's a feature, it's a topographic feature that you can identify just by looking at it. It's small enough you can look at it and go, okay, that's a bench. You might go, okay, that's a spur, that's a draw, that's a dry creek bed. You might see a bench, and a bench is a topographic feature of land that is flattened out and has a very relative to the slope around it, flat area on it. And so this bench, this flat area, can be anywhere from about the size that I'm on. In fact, you'll find many benches like this on very steep slopes, and those are inevitably bedding areas if it's good animal habitat. But you'll also find benches that are, 100 yards long, a size of a football field, a few hundred yards long. And you'll find that also maybe on a big steep slope. And so when the animals come across this, they're wise to it. They pay attention to it. These benches, as you might imagine, particularly a big 100 to 300 yards per se, is going to support its own little microclimate of flora. And so that's also going to possibly be a great feeding area in the middle of an otherwise thick forest or something like that. And so benches are just where animals bed very often, particularly if it's a sloped area. And so if you can find the north-facing slope, and that northeast-facing tending one with water and food and a bench on that steep slope, there's your e-scouting plan. Just look for that little specific area, and man, that's like, I explain it like trout, that any of these areas that I've described, finding bulls at timberline, finding the bulls and or cows interacting in these kind of parks and meadows to establish the hierarchy, finding the animals in their beds in these preferred intended areas. Finding them, like an analogy you might understand, is like finding trout somewhere in a stream or a river, we'll say. The trout can occur at any place in the river at any time. But there are going to be consistent places that we will say hold trout. Areas that once trout come across them, they recognize them as having their needs there. You know, we will say a trout will often go in front of or behind a big old rock where the current is breaking, and it has everything it needs there. It has some rest, it might have some shelter, it might have some food coming by because of the way the current's interacting with it. And so it will hold this, you know, under riverbanks. This is a common place we find brown trout, right? And that's for the same reason. It's a calorically efficient resting area for them to sift food out of the stream and not put in a whole lot of energy to chase things down if they don't have to. Or if they do, just make a quick sprint and then get back to their safe. And they're safe under there as well from predators. And so these areas, you might, once you kind of learn about a river, you can say that's where you might target your lures and say, oh, this area is going to hold trout. This area really might hold trout. And you watch someone like Chad LaChance. He's surgical on a river. He's like, oh, right over there, this area over here it's where he's going to be holding, you know. He goes on the pooter. It's insane. And so same with elk. These areas, there's going to be lots of areas in the geography, in the mountain ranges, on the mountain itself, depending on how big the mountain is, that will tend to hold elk more than other areas. You may see elk in these deep forests. You may see them out in these huge, vast, dry plains. But oftentimes you'll see them, they're walking through there. And they're walking through there on their way to these areas that will hold them. Just like a trout might move quickly across the middle of an exposed river. Sure, you see the trout there, but that's not where it's going to be consistently found, and it's certainly not a good place to target it with the lure. And same with an elk, it may not be the best place for you to target it. So some insight about areas that hold elk and why and how they might exist in the spaces that they do. So as far as where to find elk, distance from roads or trails is not really important at all. It doesn't have to be a long distance is what I mean. It can be measured in miles or yards from a and I mean the busiest roads we have in Colorado. And it's because elk are not tolerant of being bumped by humans. They're not tolerant of repeated human interactions. They're actually extremely tolerant of human sight and smell, if they know that it's not consistently going to be leading to an interaction. So think about the smartest, let's just say, border collie. You know I say that because I've seen this video where this border collie has a pile of toys, and it's like, I don't know, it's like 50 or maybe like 150 toys, and the lady has a name for all the toys, and she goes, go get Barney, go get whoever. And the dog goes and gets a specific toy every single time. It has that amazing of memory, that part of its cortex, or whatever part of the brain that's involved with that. And so I say that to say elk are even smarter than that. We're not going to sit there and train an elk on 150 toys, but an elk is ridiculously intelligent. And so I tell my kids this, we have human intelligence, trout have trout intelligence, and elk has elk intelligence. So, I wouldn't have an elk do my taxes, but they definitely are very savvy to how to exist in their habitat safely. I mean, obviously they've been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years, So again, they're very tolerant of human noise and not so much human contact. So if they are in an area where for whatever reason humans do not breach that border, they'll exist there. I have never ceased to be amazed by how tolerant elk can be of that. There's one road I'm thinking of where it's not a highway, but it's a forest road, and it's on its way to a backcountry resort or something. There's a few different things back there. There's many hunting camps back there and outfitters. And all day there's horse trailers going down that road. It's so, it's like once every 20 to 30 minutes. You can't take a nap back there. kills me, because you just hear thump, 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 thump over the, the 6 axles of the horse trailer going over the ruts in the road. And it's by that road, as many of those roads are in Colorado, is the bottom of a valley, between 2 big old mountains or hills, whatever. And there's a river next to it, something between a creek and a river. And people never cross that creek. It's a bit in like the back part of Colorado, if you will, and so there's not a lot of fly fishermen. There's like no fly fishermen. By then, there's so many other creeks and rivers, I suppose, that I don't even know the name of. I know the name of it off the top of my head, the river, the body of water, but it's not like blue metal or anything. It's not crazy. There's good trout there. I've pulled a lot of good trout out of there, but it's, anyways, this body of water is like, I don't know, maybe 30 feet wide, 40 feet wide. And there's no formal human crossing, no bridge across it for 20 miles. And so no one crosses it. It's public land. It's not even a tag you have to apply for, but people don't cross it for this reason or that. I don't know. And I say all that to say, I was sitting there one day and I was hunting this area, and a vehicle just went by, pump, the thump, and I heard a bugle, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, man, that thing is like a couple 100 yards away, but that would mean that it's down by the river there, and there's all these cars. And I grabbed my bow and scooted my happy ass down there, and I got down to the river and I let out a bugle, safely far back, and the animal bugled from way up on the hill, and it was an animal. There was an elk there, and lo and behold, literally yards from where cars are driving by constantly in archery season with hunters everywhere, this thing knew that, you know what, I haven't seen a single person over here. And so I crossed that river, and you can kind of tell in Colorado where people have been, like there's Modelo cans, there's something, there's footprints, there's something. But this area was pretty darn pristine. And I did this like the next day after I put my pants back on, because I was in camps cooking. And so the next day I went back and went across the river, went up just like 100, 200 vertical feet. There happened to be a nice, really big old nice bench there, aspens. Let out a bugle. He bugles back. We kind of play Marco Polo for the morning.
Ready, Marco Polo.
And then I see him across the canyon at 50 yards. That's where he's bedded down. As I bugle at him, he gets up and starts some raking on a big old bush. I see him at 50 yards. My point on with that bow was 46 yards. So that was a beautiful day. Let's see. So they're more tolerant of human noise than human contact. I've been finding elk in OTC and really easy to draw units consistently under a mile from the roads. I've done a lot of backcountry hunts. See the llama drama story. I've done a lot of backcountry hunts and a lot of backpacking, and I love it. But oh my God, is it difficult to haul not only your backpacking stuff back there, but then your hunting stuff, and then, oh my God, to hunt out of camp after you hike back there. I'm in good shape. I grew up here, but it's an epic. It's an epic, and I'm going on 40, and to combine them all is just not interesting to me anymore. And so I don't hunt farther than about 2.5 miles from the truck in a radius. And that's how I plan my hunting. That's also a really good distance for me as an individual to be able to realistically make 2 to 3 trips back and forth with whatever meat I'm going to need to bring back if and when I get something.
Want to spend less time figuring out how to hunt and spend more time scaring animals out of their beds?
Check out my course at mountainbowhunting.teachable.com. The first 50 people to sign up get 50% off with code EARLYBIRD. See you around the pond.